Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Caroline Heldman, and I am the Executive Director of the Representation Project. If you're not familiar with our work, we are a gender justice nonprofit organization that was founded by Jennifer Siebel Newsom. We use films and campaigns and sometimes research to challenge harmful gender norms and stereotypes. And the interview that you will hear today is part of our Boys Will Be Boys campaign. The goal of this campaign is to expose how traditional or restrictive masculinity really puts boys and men into a box, into a space where they have to capitulate to very narrow societal norms. And we want to break boys and men out of the man box. We want to create a space where they can reach their full human potential and thrive. So Boys Will Be Boys means that they can be anything and everything they want to be without the constraints of restrictive masculinity. This is our love letter to boys and men. And I am so delighted to be interviewing the great Bill Wrubel today. Let me read this bio. I know folks are very familiar with your work already. I've received a lot of emails saying this is really exciting that we're talking with you about this topic. So we're picking your brain today. Let me read the bio, very long. Writer and producer, Bill Wrubel, got his start on the critically acclaimed ABC series Sports Night, working with creator Aaron Sorkin as a staff writer and executive story editor before the series for 2 years. You worked briefly on the writing staff of the NBC sitcom Kristen, starring Kristen Chenoweth. And also you have won many awards, which we'll get to in a moment, including a scripted for your first feature film, the romantic comedy A Guy Thing, starring Julia Stiles and Jason Lee, if you haven't seen it. But what you may know Bill best for is his groundbreaking work on Will and Grace, the Emmy Award-winning NBC sitcom about a heterosexual female and her gay male best friend. This sitcom aired, I think, 2 months after Ellen got fired, essentially for being gay. And so this is really a pivotal moment for representations of LGBTQ plus characters, which we will get into. Bill worked on the show for 4 years, writing 11 episodes and eventually becoming the co-executive producer. And during his time on the show, the series was nominated for 4 consecutive Emmy Awards for Outstanding Comedy Series. Following his departure from that show, he returned to the hour-long format with Ugly Betty, starring American Ferrera and Vanessa Williams, another very popular show. And when the show ended, Bill stayed on with the ABC's family, working as a co-executive producer and staff writer on the acclaimed sitcom Modern Family. Yes, another show that you're probably very familiar with. Bill is also the producer of the hit show Ted Lasso, which has won 13 Emmy Awards and I think was nominated for over 50 awards. Just an incredible bio of someone who has created and been a part of creating the storylines and characters that we all know and love. So welcome, Bill. It is so good to talk with you today.
Well, thanks, Caroline. It's nice to see you.
So let's jump right in with perhaps the world's longest question to start us off. Tell us about your path to TV writing and producing, where you create storylines and characters that just openly challenge gender norms and stereotypes. I'm thinking that you especially, a lot of your characters, especially challenge the man box, which is this box that boys and men are put in, the societal pressure for boys and men to be strong, successful, powerful, dominating, fearless, and control emotionless, right? You write characters that really challenge that, right? From your groundbreaking Will and Grace that features queer leads and shatters stereotypes, masculine stereotypes, LGBTQ plus stereotypes, and normalizes queer lives, to what you did in Modern Family along those lines as well, to men embracing really healthy masculinity in Sports Night and Ted Lasso. Did you grow up thinking about gender issues, about healthy masculinity? So how did Billy become Bill?
No, that's an interesting question. I appreciate it. Actually, it's funny because I feel very lucky / privileged to have ended up working on a bunch of shows where the creators of the show and the themes and thesis behind the show had these big ideas, because I didn't grow up with particular interest, or I mean, I was just kind of a regular, grew up in suburban New Jersey, and things were really just normal in a very there wasn't a lot of social upheaval. There weren't a lot of social issues. It was an era where there wasn't social justice. And I was very much just a boy's boy to some degree. I had brothers, I played sports, but at the same time, I do know that in terms of entertainment, I was always interested in things that had some degree of social, I don't want to say agenda, but maybe if they were for the comedy I liked would often have satire in it. Like I was a fan of the original Saturday Night Live, and I liked things like that that were sort of commenting on the world we were in because I was interested in um, current events. And then certainly growing up in the 70s, the civil rights movement had really just been galvanizing in the 60s. My mom was very much a women's lib person. She went back to law school when I was a
Mm.
kid. And so
Wow.
the battle for women's rights was something that was alive in my household. And so it was always in my periphery, but it wasn't really an interest or obsession of mine necessarily. I really did. I mean, if I managed to get taller, I would have been a professional athlete, or that would have been the idea. It didn't play out that way. But but I was always interested in a progressive world. Like I definitely think I got values like that from my parents, and I paid attention to it. And I was very, you know, having just read a recent biography of Martin Luther King, somebody like that was a person who's I admired, I knew about, but again, didn't think, oh, I'm going to devote my life to social justice or these causes. And honestly, I grew up in a place where it was I don't even know what people's politics were generally, but here's one thing I will say is I didn't know if anybody, I didn't know anybody who was, for example, gay where I grew up, but which is crazy because there are gay people everywhere, obviously. But in the 70s, we didn't know. And it wasn't even really, there was no active homophobia or anything like that. It just wasn't ever really talked about. But I consider my opportunity to go to work on Will and Grace one of the great um, privileges, joys of my life because I really did get to have an understanding of a point of view that I really hadn't been exposed to as just a guy grew up in the suburbs and even in college, and when I lived in New York for a decade and I worked in the theater, and so you do start to have more diversity, but getting to work on Will and Grace and be able to tell stories about these particular men in that show, and at a moment when it's before gay men could marry, it ended up being really impactful. And I felt very lucky. Max Muchnick and David Gohan, the creators, were able to wrap in a comic show such a strong social message. You know what I mean? Which is, and 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 Max would sometimes say he was talking about being a gay man and wanted to have a family. Why wasn't I accounted for? I.e., what? And again, I don't want to make it about religion, but what am I supposed to do? You know what I mean? And
Mm-hmm.
anyway, so working on Will and Grace is one of my earliest jobs, did give me an engagement with the world in a social way and made me rethink everything I thought about being a man, being masculine. And that was a very diverse room of writers, gay people, straight people, people of color, people of all kinds of different ethnicities. And it ended up being kind of setting a template for me for what I've wanted to do since then, which is to work on shows where the audience, the job isn't necessarily to educate them because that doesn't sound fun, but ideally to like point them in the direction of a fairer universe, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And it sounds like maybe your experience on Will and Grace informed the masculinity that you were writing in later shows, or the brand of masculinity, if you will.
Definitely. And what's kind of funny, actually, and I've confessed this, now I'm confessing it publicly, it's embarrassing. I got hired on that show and I was like, I don't think I know enough about the gay experience, gay people. Like, you know what I mean? I didn't really, again, I grew up in a time when it was people were closeted. And so I went out and bought an issue of New York Magazine because it was like the gay issue or whatever. It was like the whole issue of that particular the whole point of that particular issue was like gay New York, whatever. And there was an article in there about the New York City Gay Men's Health Choir, which was a thing I had heard of. And and so I was like, oh, that's kind of funny. And so the first week I was working on the show, I pitched this idea about using the Gay Men's Health Choir as a storyline, and that ended up becoming a storyline that we ended up doing. It was kind of a hugely rated episode for us, where Matt Damon and Sean Hayes's character were in conflict because Matt Damon wasn't really gay, but he wanted to sing in a choir. And so anyway, it became a very successful episode that I stumbled into because I was afraid. I was like, how am I going to know enough about the gay experience? And then what's funny is then I worked on the show for a while, and people who know me are like, oh, you're plenty gay. You didn't need to do any research, just meaning that my view of the, I don't, I've been a guy's guy, but at the same time, I don't ever feel like I've boxed myself in terms of things I care about. And so, for example, musical theater, this is a cliche, but I love it. So anyway, it was a joy to work on that show because I did get to tap into a part of myself, which I don't think I fully knew, which was masculinity that needn't be classic masculinity.
Yes. Okay. So you are on this path-breaking show and have ever since used the power of storytelling to create worlds you want to live in, or I assume this is what you are doing because these are the worlds I want to live in. Talk to us about the power generally, or maybe specifically, of entertainment media to shift hearts and minds in the real world. And you had mentioned Will and Grace. What other shows or characters do you think have had some really great impact? Or maybe if you want to speak more about Will and Grace.
Yeah, look, I do think it's an interesting question because I think that look, as I said, I think I learned a little bit about social justice from watching shows in the 70s, like Mary Tyler Moore, for example, and I was always a big fan of Saturday Night Live, and Saturday Night Live satirized social issues, and they made the side that they were on, which was the progressive side, the funny, cool side, and I'm like, oh, that's the side I want to be on, you know? Uh, and I also was always a big music fan, and I felt the same way about the artists who I was a fan of, which is they seem to have a vision of a world where beyond peace and love, which is just so general, but where people are treated with respect. You know what I mean? And that just again, I just was seduced into it because it seemed that's what the cool people wanted, and I'm like, well, that, again, I want to be where the cool people are, but that amplified into actual convictions that I really feel very strongly about, and and so yeah, and also I just want to say selfishly, it was a real joy. I would go to school as a parent with my kids, and gay couples occasionally I would come up to me and be like, I saw your name, you write on Modern Family, I know you wrote on Will and Grace, and they would be like, thank you. And what's, by the way, it was not my doing. The people who I worked for were the visionaries, but they were appreciated because I think it helped within, they're like, it helped me and my family, it helped me, it helped me feel comfortable here in the schoolyard as a gay dad with, with a husband who's a man. And so that was really, a, a, I mean, this is going to sound silly, but really a blessing for me. And so I was glad to be a part of something only because I know I benefited, for, like I said, from being exposed to music and films and television shows that had, that were trying to dramatize or celebrate a more diverse America.
Yeah, and your shows, it seem to do, as I'm thinking about this, two big things that help with inclusion, right? One is, and you talk about making inclusion, or the liberal side, which I would conflate with inclusion, as being the cool side, right? And then you see Will and Grace really making the show about queerness, right?
Yeah,
About various subcultures within the queer community. And then with Modern Family, you see a different dynamic, which is just the normalization of queerness, right?
yeah.
Of a gay couple. Very different approaches, but both highly impactful. You've been at the cultural forefront of mainstream shows about characters that challenge gender and sexuality norms. And part of the impact is, I guess I would name it like the Trojan horse. You're in a
Yeah.
mainstream setting, right? You're delivering it with laughs and entertainment. But what's at the forefront, or what's considered to be at the forefront, is constantly shifting. So this is a long way of asking what you're thinking about LGBTQ plus representations today versus maybe what you thought about in the past, or healthy masculinity. In other words, how have your notions of gender fluidity and masculinity and queerness shifted over time?
Yeah, look, again, I've really benefited from what I've been exposed to and watching the culture shift. And so, uh, yeah, I mean, I think you just really said something interesting, which was Will and Grace was one step in that process, and it was so novel at the time. Again, Max Muchnick and David Cohen. And then Chris Lloyd and Steve Levitan on Modern Family, neither of whom are gay men, uh, but their vision was we want to have a show that explores the world as it's evolving. You know what I mean? And so that is so I will say two things, which is that one is that it's yes, I think you have to find the next step along the way. You know what I mean? Like Will and Grace was ultimately a show really at the heart about a gay guy and a straight woman who could never consummate their relationship, but they end up having to find love. She has to go here and he has to go here. But then and within Modern Family, we had a gay couple at the very core who could get married and raise a kid. So that was a step. And I can't, I don't have a crystal ball, none of us do, to see where the next step in that will be. But I do think maintaining, keeping your eye on it, i.e., continuing for me to want to work on shows or to create shows where there's diversity, it's just organically part of it and doesn't feel stapled on afterwards. But when you develop something or you start day one in the writer's room and you're like, okay, let's talk about each of these characters. And ideally when something's created, it's baked right in. You know what I mean? So that to me continues to be both the opportunity and the challenge, which is like, where is the future of LG, all those themes, the LGBTEQ storylines, what is the future of it? But at the same time, it's like, so we want to have our foot on the gas a little bit, but also let's not pump the brakes by not doing it at all.
So staying kind of right on the edge, which is constantly shifting, recording it, but then the moment the moment you have something in the can or it airs is the moment it's already shifted.
That's exactly right. And it's tricky because I do think there's always fear and people are like, we don't want to alienate the audience. And is the audience ready for two gay men to kiss on TV? Is it ready for two gay men to get married on TV? And so it's a little bit of a push-pull between the vision of the creative people and the actors and everybody executing it. And also to a degree, like the audience has to be ready for it, And so, but I think with regard to the queer life in America, the audience has proved that they're ready for it and treats it like it's not that big a deal, like, yeah. And that's been really great. And I can't sit here and say that I've the person who had those visions, but I've really enjoyed bringing them to life. And I've benefited from that, the way I look at the world.
Well, and we've all benefited from your work on that. And there's just such a clear connection in my mind between having more diverse representations of men and masculinity, and often, through the lens of, for example, gay men, because it pushes the envelope on what it means to be a man more broadly. And so this brings us to what I think you'll probably get a lot of questions about in the Q&A, which is your most recent show. Let's talk about healthy masculinity through the lens of Ted Lasso. So he's a coach, and unlike the stereotypical coach who's barking orders and focusing almost exclusively on winning and putting pressure on players to do that, Ted is empathetic, he's self-reflexive, he does his best to bring out the best in people, he believes the best in people, and at its core, the show is about a human who has an impact on other human beings, very actively so. It's widely been acclaimed as an excellent portrayal of healthy masculinity, or actually a variety of masculinities. Tell us about this show and how it was created, how Ted was created.
Yeah, look, again, I know I keep sort of harping on it, but at the core, you need to have a person with a vision, And I remember I had read the written pilot script of Ted Lasso, which was written by Jason Sudeikis and Brendan Hunt and Joe Kelly and Bill Lawrence. And Jason obviously was going to play the character of Ted Lasso, a character that he'd that he'd created for these promos for NBC Sports that were kind of goofy. But then I read the pilot and I went in to talk to him for the very first time, and it had surprised me. And I said to him, this script is melancholy at times, and that struck a chord with me. And again, this is a year and a half before Ted Lasso ended up on TV, and it's right before we started even writing the first season. Jason was like, yeah, I want him to have the biggest panic attack anybody could possibly have on TV. I mean, he was exaggerating, but he had a vision early on, because everything you just described about Ted Lasso, I would assign to Jason Sudeikis, and I don't mean to be, that's a compliment, by the way. So he was, and he was interested in, I think, that exact thing, because he is very much a guy's guy, very athletic, basketball player in college, but he was interested in the side of masculinity that doesn't have all the answers. You know what I mean? And so
Mm,
that's actually the beauty of it, is that in theory, Ted has the answers because you're the coach and the buck stops there. But what he really does is ask a lot of questions. You know what I mean? Even in the very first scene with Hannah Waddingham's character, Rebecca, I mean, he's asking her about her ex-husband. You know what I mean? And so there's an interest in, there's an empathy in the character that is by design from the actor, that wants to pay attention to the whole world, and but in doing so doesn't always pay attention to himself, which is
mm,
ultimately what brings his emotions crashing down on him throughout the series.
The treatment of mental health in the second season is just extraordinary. I mean, we haven't seen that on television, and we haven't seen it in such a real way with men and a man in a position of power.
Yeah, it was really fun to talk about that character of Dr. Sharon. We got an incredible actor to play it. And again, that's just, it's the vision of the people behind the scenes. And then I was part of a great staff of writers who all were like, many of whom are in therapy. You know what I mean? And so mental health wasn't, that was the interesting thing. It was like when Jason wanted to talk about the character having a giant anxiety attack, I was like, oh, well, I have some history with this. And then I was also able to tell him not even necessarily my own stories, but stories of people I admired. For instance, Bruce Springsteen in his biography talks, and I'm from New Jersey, big Springsteen fan, talks about it. He's been at the end of his giant world tour, and he's at a pub in Dublin celebrating after being on the road for a year and a half. And he starts feeling a breakdown, and he has to go out and call his therapist back in America. And I'm not laughing because it's funny. I'm laughing because it just shows you that mental health is an issue for people you wouldn't even imagine, a rock star. You know what I mean? And so I talked about that with Jason in that meeting, just because I do think you can, two things can be true at the same time. You can appear to be a person who has all the answers, and you can be very much undone, bedeviled, filled with doubt, anxious, and still be a man, by the way, at the same time. You know, and owning those feelings doesn't make you less of a man. It's,
Yeah, it makes you human.
yeah, yeah, no, exactly.
It's,
That-
yeah,
That's
and it's
right.
so wild how, the man box asks men and boys to bifurcate their head and their heart and really cut themselves off from so many of the things that make us human. Um,
Yeah,
the wonderful parts.
yeah. No,
And
I
yeah,
we you and I have talked about this before. I think that's exactly it. It's like you grow up, I think boys grew up, I certainly did, with like, oh, when I do this, I'll be a man. When I accomplish that, I'll be a man. When I do take this next step in my life, I'll be a man. And what the thing that I've come to believe is that I was always a man. You know what I mean? I wasn't a man, I was a boy, but you know what I mean? I was always a man. And the idea that I need to hang my masculinity on an achievement is um is a myth.
yeah, and it's a myth that so many men believe their whole lives because it's
Yeah.
such a dominant cultural narrative. One of the things I love about Ted Lasso are the relationships between the men, right? And this is so purposeful, the way the show is created, the creators have written this. Instead of the more classic male bonding over misogyny and homophobia, which you would actually expect in a sports show, Ted actually comes in and establishes early on that the bonding is going to be authentic. It's going to be real friendships. It's not going to be around, for example, objectifying or degrading women. And you really do quite a number with, Keely's character and making her very complicated, even though she could be the stereotypical femme fatale kind of sex object. Talk to us about the approach to male friendships in Ted Lasso and how you create positive, how you made these decisions and maybe how it has shifted over time.
Yeah, I think again, I have to give shout out to the other people I work on the show with, because, and particularly there was the first season of Ted Lasso, the like Jason and Bill Lawrence did an incredible thing, which is they hired, and I don't see incredible because it shouldn't seem incredible, but that staff had five incredibly strong female writers. And so there was, and I like to think that the men in the staff had some sensitivity, but we all have our limitations. But the women writers on that show from the first season were like, can you guys stop talking about soccer? This is so fucking boring. You know what I mean? And, or they would be like, no, Rebecca wouldn't do that. Or, and I mean, and again, all of the men who were in that room, I don't think our intentions were to necessarily um, minimize or marginalize or be inaccurate about the female characters. But, and I like to think that the men can write women characters, but the women on that staff stood up for the female characters in a way. And beyond that, they also brought a jaundiced eye to the way men communicate. So we would talk about that too. And so that was sort of, I think it was a twofold bonus, which was that the women became three-dimensional, and that friendship between Keely and Rebecca, I think was for me, maybe the backbone of the show. And at the same time, we're able to write the guys as men actually are, even though we'd like to admit it, which is like full of doubt, nervous, insecure, our bluster covering like worry. And that was, and it was, I remember the very first table read we had of the show, I was like, oh, the locker room scenes were really funny, the first table read. And I was like, oh, it's a workplace comedy, and the locker room just happens to be a workplace. And so a male ensemble can, in a locker room, just gives us a venue where these guys, the fun of it is going to be not them swaggering with macho posturing all the time. The fun of it is going to be them trying to figure out what's a good birthday present for somebody,
Yeah, sort of real life instead of the
Right.
bravado performance of sports, heroes or stars. And yet the relationship, the intergenerational female friendship between Keely and Rebecca is incredible. Also the relationship between Ted and Rebecca, where it
Yeah.
isn't sexualized, that's not really a part of it. And then Jamie Tartt's the father wound
Yeah.
storyline that you open up is so powerful. And then the mentoring between Roy and Jamie, and we can go on and on about it. Take a book on restrictive masculinity and all of the issues, the drivers of that and what comes up. It feels like Ted Lasso's kind of going through, I mean, from an academic perspective, going through and checking things off, except it doesn't feel that way at all. It's an incredible
Yeah.
story.
We didn't approach it. It's been a real highlight for me to get to participate in that. But it's an interesting thing, which is, yes, I think we approach some stuff with intention, but other things you just sort of stumble into, I mean, the relationship between uh Phil Dunster and Brett Goldstein's character, Jamie and Roy, particularly in season 3, where he sort of becomes a mentor to him. That was a function of the show evolved. Those two actors were great. They were great together, and so we wanted to continue to explore it. And so yes, and again, I will also say you're in a comedy writer's room, and so comedy, you're gonna like. There's a reason that I'm trying to think of a good example. Like Tom Brady, I'm not digging the Patriots. Everybody can calm down. But like Tom Brady is not necessarily going to be a laugh riot. You know what I mean? And Will Ferrell is. So ultimately, we're in a room of people where we'd rather be writing for Will Ferrell than Tom Brady. And so there is a natural inclination among the men to be like, we put the door ajar of our vulnerabilities, and it seems to be the audience likes it. Let's keep doing that. And that was just a really fun environment to be in,
Yeah.
where people could tell anecdotes of their own, like, oh my God, just their own mental health challenges where there aren't life and death, and we do know it can be life and death, not that, but in a way that it was entertaining. And that was a fun thing to put into stories.
And it's not sterile. It is, it's ribald. It's funny.
Yeah.
You've got, queer storyline. You just got a lot of really, I don't want to do any spoilers. I sort of do, but we won't do spoilers, but you have a great diversity of queer characters
Yeah.
and storylines on the show, which is really great as well. And you have all of these different, I think maybe the most powerful thing for me for Ted Lasso is all of the different types of masculinity. It's not one thing. It's certainly not the man box, but there's definitely some like macho bravado. But you have a variety. And so it dispels this myth that men can only be one thing. And it does that, by just having so many men on in the cast who are represented in such diverse ways.
Yeah, and again, I just to give tribute to them, and they were both great and I was going to say good enough, but they're better than good enough. They were great actors, so they could play it, and they didn't back off from playing it. You know what I mean? Because there's also a type of actor and female male who like they don't really want to put their vulnerability out there for fear of looking less than or judged by the audience. You know what I mean? And in our case, every one of those actors, there wasn't an emotional excavation that they weren't willing to undertake for their characters, and that was really fun.
Mm, yeah, just great. And the coach and the assistant coach, that
Yeah,
that
yeah, no. And again, I'm not here to hype up people who aren't me, but a lot of it was Jason Sudeikis had a vision and had an open-mindedness towards humanity and has a gentle view towards other people that allowed everybody else who was lucky enough to be on the show to go down those roads.
And I wonder what sort of impact, I would love to measure the impact of that in the real world with coaches. I'm guessing he's probably shifted them some models of coaching.
That's interesting. Yeah, look, I do know that he's real coaches reach out and I to the extent that I had any limited experience, this is name dropping and I apologize, but I once was maybe kicking around doing an idea with Doc Rivers, and what I learned just spending a little bit of time with him was how much of his job was emotional management. You know what I mean? And it was really inspiring for me to hear that, you know, and he was able to articulate how he could best do his job by actually looking inside what was going on in a person. And so I do think it's some coaches, and I don't know, you know, and I know as a former athlete, not professional, but you know, when I had coaches, the more that a coach could look into my to a degree fragile nature, and like if I was on a soccer team, which I was, and I had an off half, which I did, or maybe or an off game, when I got treated with gentleness, it made me, I was able to put it in the rearview mirror, you know? And so I do think that's also the thing, which is that Jason Sudeikis in real life in the show, but also the character of Ted Lasso wants to create an environment where people can be the best version of themselves. And in being the best version of themselves, they can be the best athletes they can be, you know?
Absolutely. Our film, our documentary film, The Mask You Live In, explores the power of coaches. They're not the only cultural purveyors that have that sort of power. You also have parents and teachers and
Yes.
media,
Oh my
but
God.
coaches play such a huge role for young men. And Coach Joel Ehrman, uh, speaks so eloquently on that in the film. So one last question about your work, right? In a world where man box expectations are really separated on two sides, right? On one side, we've got a wider embrace of better practices of manhood and healthier masculinity and fatherhood, where men are spending more time with their children and they have the freedom and the power to do that. They're breaking out of the man box. And then on the other side, you see in the past decade the rise of the manosphere, increasingly hyper-masculine, misogynistic rhetoric from leaders, from social media influencers. What role do you think entertainment media can play to lead us in, well, obviously, I think it's a healthier direction.
Yeah.
What do you anticipate?
Yeah, it's interesting. Look, you and I met through Yalda Ills in the Center for Scholars and Storytelling, which has been, I participated, and as I've said, I've gotten more out of it than I put in because it's been really interesting to me to really learn how boys and men are impacted by the representations they see in the media and in storytelling, et cetera, and that small um, intentional choices in program, like in crafting things, can really open up the world for a boy who's trying to figure out how to be a man. You know what I mean? And that's a never ending process. And so I definitely am a believer that like that that what masculinity can be anything. You know what I mean? It really can be. And it's, like I said, the more if I look back on my own life, I was like, I wish that I was less even hung up on having to be such a guy, although I'm sure people would be like, you were never such a guy. But you know what I mean? I just felt like I had to sometimes play a role.
Yeah.
And so and that can be a very self-defeating voice because you're like, no, I shouldn't be interested in that, or I shouldn't be curious about that because that's not right down the middle. But the more I've grown and observed the world, the more I realize like there's there's the win is not being down the middle. It just isn't, you know? And like we all and again, the Ted Lasso, those shows you've all mentioned have given me the gift of being able to, I hope, grow a little bit. And so that would be that's all I know is that I think that let your curiosity take you where you're interested in and then that just becomes who you are as a man. You know what I mean? And obviously for a woman too. It's like so I do think that being constricted by the like square jawed, handsome, you know, the guy who kicks sand in the other guy's face at the beach, that's a really old reference, is like is a myth that once I've observed it exploded is really quite liberating, you know, and I would just want that to liberation to be offered to other people because I think then that's a path to meaning in life.
Well, okay, one last personal question before we open it up to the audience, and feel free to put your questions in the Q&A. We'll get to everything. Um, Bill, if you ran into your younger self right now and talk with him, what advice or knowledge would you share?
That's funny. I would definitely say don't quit things. You know what I mean? Because I do think sometimes, for example, even with my creative work, I'd be like, this is terrible. I don't know what I'm doing, or I don't like just see things through is important. But I also would have been like, to, like, you don't have, I remember this is funny, kind of my friend's brother, he was like a strapping dude and he would wear this waffle shirt, like this waffle. And I was like, I'm getting a waffle shirt because he's cool and tough. And that's what like cool, tough guys wear. And then I remember I went out or I got my parents to get me a waffle shirt. And I was still the same skinny 14-year-old without any significant physique. And I was like, oh, no, the shirt didn't transform me at all. I am who I am. So I wish I was able to say, dude, being who you are is fun. You know
Yeah.
what I mean?
Yeah.
And there's going to be a time and a place for weightlifting if you want to do it later or today. But like, there's no physique that you have to emulate in order to be yourself. You can just be yourself without any effort. And I would encourage myself not to judge me for, you know, for anything that seemed, like I said, that wasn't right down the middle.
Mm. So don't judge you for not
Yeah, like I'll
pursuing
be like
things.
here, like this is
Yeah.
I don't know if you guys can see it. I just touched, I have a
Yes.
guitar. Like I love music and I didn't stick with music lessons because I was like, no, I can't because I'm into sports. I play
Ah,
baseball. And
yeah.
and I picked up the guitar at age 50 and it was one of the greatest decisions of my life. And my only regret is I'm terrible because I didn't start when I was younger, you know? But I wish
Mhm.
you would be like, no, no, what you could play a musical instrument and you can also play soccer. So, but for
Yeah.
some reason, it was very much a zero-sum game in those choices. And so there are things that I wish I had followed through on, like learning music.
So many boys share that story of leaving choir, of leaving music, or
Yeah.
leaving like they can't play the flute. It's too feminized. Yeah, it's what a shame. I think about all of the collective genius and creative energy that we have just lost, and even entrepreneurial and inventions that we've just lost because
Yeah.
we didn't start everybody at a place where they can thrive. Okay, great question from Allison. Ted Lasso was the first time I saw a man have a panic attack on TV. Amazing. Why was that chosen for Ted?
Again, well, that was Jason's idea. And like I said, it was the thing he mentioned to me. This is 4 months before we even started writing, or whenever I first met him. Um, and, and I can't speak to it on Jason's behalf. You know, I think that it probably because he had experiences or observed or had heard, because he, like I said, he is a guy's guy. He's a tremendous good athlete, basketball player, charming, roguish. But I think he also is able to. He's a sensitive human being, and so and I I don't, I would like to consider myself sensitive. I don't think the people I live with every day would always say that, but I'd like to think. So I was able to, if bring anything was like, I can get on board this vision of let's have a sensitive person. And so then it was really fun. And I do mean fun. Okay, we're going to give Ted is going to suffer this panic attack. Let's talk about the season arc that builds up to it. So it wasn't just like, oh, and then he has a panic attack. No, it was again, the idea was it was fruit of a It was fruit of a character arc that went the whole season long, where at this particular moment, when things are going well for Ted as a coach, because it's a moment where they win this game, it's exactly a moment that he realizes he hasn't paid attention to his own needs, his own feelings, in that case regarding the breakup of his marriage. And so it was and again, I will credit the actor was willing to play that. You know what I mean? The actor was willing to um play a character who looked, this is not the right word for it, but he runs out of a party. He's out on a curb, huddled in a ball. Some people might say that's pathetic, but I, I would say it's sympathetic because he's so vulnerable, you know? And, and so to your question, it was by design. And then it was also by, it wasn't just, it wasn't a thunderbolt. Like we worked on it, and then it was very specifically written, very specifically acted, and very specifically staged. And again, the word I come back to, and it was intentional.
And it was realistic too, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it
I
doesn't
mean,
just come out of nowhere.
yeah,
Yeah. And it also gave an opportunity to show what is so often modeled in Ted Lasso, which is the support of other people, whether it's Rebecca
yeah,
coming out or whether it's the teammates or, I don't want to be a spoiler, but someone coming out as gay, and
yeah,
then the support, the opportunities for male bonding that have nothing to do with kind of traditional forms.
yeah. And look, if I did anything right, it was recognizing all those good ideas that were often suggested by other people. You know what I mean? Because I was like, and then I'm like, oh, that's a great idea. This particular, that player is in the closet, and we don't know it, but we're going to point to it. You know what I mean? So, or things like that. Like there would just be good ideas that many of which were not mine, and I'm not being overly modest, but I was able to be like, oh, I think an audience will enjoy that because it felt true, to me.
Well, along those lines, Anonymous asks, Modern Family played a huge role in opening up my young mind. Was there anything you did to push the social justice envelope on Modern Family that you wouldn't do if you were writing the show in 2024?
That's a really interesting question. No, I don't think that I think that the writers and the actors and in that instance, again, Chris Lloyd and Steve Levitan, the show creators, were brave enough that they were like, we don't give a shit what America's reaction is to this. I mean, they wanted people to like it, but they weren't like there was no fear, And I do believe that in 2024, there's even less fear about that in terms of being creative, in terms of what people are doing when they're putting TV show or creating TV shows or creating characters. No, I actually think that, and this would not be up to me, but if we were doing Modern Family in 2024, that we would that probably the bar, the bar has gotten even higher in terms of what's progressive, and so in the in just in terms of the fluidity of gender, and I would imagine that we would find a way to investigate that. Is what
Mm,
I think. I don't think we would be moving backwards.
yeah. Another anonymous question. Have you been surprised by any pushback you've gotten from Hollywood's powers that be when it comes to challenging stereotypical depictions of masculinity or women?
No, I mean, I think that the executives sometimes, I do feel like sometimes a Will and Grace, there could be a sense, and again, but it wasn't rooted in any individual person's homophobia. It was just more like, what's the audience going to accept or reject? You know what I mean? But I think at this point, um, I think that the people who run streamers and networks are agnostic, i.e. they want to create entertainment that an audience will enjoy. And I think they continue to discover that audiences accept new ideas. And so I haven't gotten a ton of pushback, and nor have I observed it, but I've also been blessed to work with creators with convictions. And I'll be perfectly honest, and a lot of these executives also have convictions. But nobody wants to be throwing propaganda out there, and nobody wants to get on a soapbox, and nobody wants to be finger waggy. So I think if there's ever been any pushback, and it's more along the lines of what's the most entertaining way to tell this story. And I had the good fortune once of being on a panel with Dustin Lance Black, who wrote Milk, and just wrote the Bayard Rustin movie. And he said something so smart. I was sort of hemming and hawing about this exact issue. And he said, well, it's the job of the writer to dramatize it. You know what I mean? And that is exactly it. If you can do a good job dramatizing it, I don't think there's anything that people will push back on.
Yeah, if the storytelling is
It
good
really is.
enough.
And so his point was like, if they're rejecting it, you could do a get better job as a storyteller. Don't throw away this idea that you have.
Yeah, well, dovetails with that a little bit about audience and executives. Anonymous asks, what will it take to convince executives that audiences enjoy seeing themselves represented positively on screen? I assume they're referring to marginalized people, maybe who don't necessarily get the screen time commensurate with their numbers in the population. Do we need more research connecting diversity on screen to numbers at the box office?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I'm not fully equipped to answer it, but I will say I do think that success, look, this is a business of entertainment, you know what I mean? But the business, when a show like, which I'm a fan of, Abbott Elementary and Quinta Brunson put on that character and put on that world and put on that show, it does change people's perceptions. You know what I mean? And so, and the same thing applies. So I do think ultimately it's like anything, either something is creatively praised, you know, and which doesn't necessarily always translate into a big audience, or like Barbie, you get a giant audience for something that is portraying a point of view that people were like, all those different female points of view, all those points of view about humanity. So though it always helps to make for something to be a hit. It really is. I mean, it's a hit-driven
Yeah.
business. And I don't know and I don't know how to make a hit. I don't. Like, I just know how to participate in someone else's original idea that I think sounds entertaining, you
Yeah.
know?
But
So
you've made hits. You've made almost, have you ever, I mean, you've made exclusively hits.
well, I can't, I mean, as much as I would like, I can't take credit for it. I've been very lucky. I do, again, if I've done anything right, I feel like I've had an instinct sometimes for that. Well, that
Yeah.
seems interesting. That seems like a good idea. That person seems talented. I'm going to throw in with them.
Mm,
So,
mm.
yeah, a lot. Some of that is just luck. I mean, I wish I could say it's a divine plan, but no.
Well, and you know, we've talked about this. No one knows the show anymore, but Sports Night maybe wasn't a hit.
Yeah.
It's my favorite of what I love everything you've done, but I loved it at the time because it was so pathbreaking. Dana's character, of course, you see
Yeah.
yourself on screen, you're like, there's a woman grappling with everything that I grapple with or will be soon, and the relationships between the men. So it was 2 seasons, so maybe it was a bit of a
Yeah, but
hit.
that's a good example. I think it's funny again, and that was Aaron Sorkin's vision, and and we were kind of at the same time as he had another show, West Wing, and West Wing really was a giant hit, and Sports Night wasn't as much of a hit, and I can't point to exactly why that is, but because the themes in both of the shows are not that dissimilar, you know, and but yeah, so that's an interesting point. I do think if we had continued to do Sports Night, that Aaron would have wanted, and the writers and actors would have enjoyed getting more and more emotionally complex in that show. But that is an example of where it didn't fully, and I agree with you. I think Felicity Huffman's character of Dana was a great creation, brilliantly played by the actor, that was sort of more fully realized in other women down the line. You know what I mean? Whether
Mm.
it was Allison Janney's character in The West Wing, or Carmela Soprano, or Hannah Waddingham, you know, but the idea was there, and it was an interesting character and a challenging character and a fun character to write because we were getting into that area of a complicated woman.
Very complicated. And the relationships with the men and the men's friendships, but I don't know, I always thought it was because it was a show about sports that was about a woman or centered
Yeah.
a woman. I was like, yeah, maybe before it's time. So, I'm pitching for you to
No, 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 it was
buy
really
that
fun to
bill.
work on. That was no, it was really fun to work on. And again, I credit to Aaron. Like, it was a show set at a sports network where it was not literally about sports very often.
Yeah, it was about relationships. And in
Yes.
fact, if I were to say there's a through line for all of the shows that your instinct, your gut tells you to pick, or your, genius tells you this is going to be a hit. or maybe not a hit, but it's good, and you're maybe not thinking about hit. I don't know, but it's that they're actually all about relationships, right? They're complicated stories of relationships.
I think that that's right. And by the way, I'm not like some genius picker. Sometimes those are the only jobs offered to me. So I want to make it clear. I wasn't like drowning in a flood of opportunities. I just sort of stumbled into things,
Hmm,
you know.
fascinating.
Uh, yeah, I mean, maybe sometimes I have an instinct, but then sometimes it just was like that's just what destiny presented itself, or how it does that destiny presented itself. And I was like, all right, I'll do that. I got to keep working. But yeah, no, it's again, it's if I've done, I was able to. I'm a little bit of a to a fault. Like I can be, I think, yes, and because I like getting on board. I was, like I said, I've tried to emphasize my athletic credentials in this interview, but I really did love sports. I loved playing on team sports, and I was never the star of any team I was on, but I liked contributing and I liked supporting. And so that's been one of the joys of of working in television. It is collaborative, and you get to work with other with
Mm.
smart, funny people who can help make you better.
Mm. So, a question about whether or not you've gotten pushback from, well, the woke left. Have you gotten any pushback because of your identity? So you're
Oh,
not
me?
a gay man, but you're writing for that. You're
No, I mean, but I've also always been on staff. I mean, look, this is a complicated question and a really interesting question because there is an issue very much now of identity with regard to gender and race and all of these things. You know what I mean? And it's like, who can write what? And I, I loved writing um, Will and Jack on Will and Grace. I am not a gay man, yet I could channel, I like to think I could channel aspects of my personality into them that were really fun for me to write that I hope translated for the audience. In 2024, I don't know if that is as welcome. I don't know. I can't speak to that one way or the other. Certainly, we know that if there's a gay character on TV or on the stage, perhaps the preference is to have a gay actor play that, and and but it's so it's complicated. I think audiences respond to authenticity, and there's nothing more authentic than experience. But I also think the job of a creative person is to have imagination and imagine yourself in someone else's shoes, and that's what I like to do. So I no, have I ever felt like you shouldn't be writing this or how can you write this? I have not received that, but I also will say I've been in rooms writing gay people, writing gay characters where I have gay writers to my left and right. I've been in rooms writing black people with black people to my left and right. And so I do think that that is an important part of the process. So the onus isn't really all on me because there's just aspects of experience that I don't know.
yeah, really complicated question.
Yeah.
And a great sophisticated, right? You're embracing that complexity. Anonymous asks, what advice do you have for people trying to break into the industry?
Yeah, it's tricky. It's funny because in a weird way, I think there's never been a worse time to break indie industry, but I also think there's never been a better time. You know, there's so many avenues of storytelling now through YouTube and even on Instagram and TikTok. I don't need to tell everybody they know what it is, and so and conventional series television is the numbers are going down because there's so many different entertainment options. But I would argue that it's it's it is breachable. You know what I mean? And sometimes it feels like there's a dam up. I don't know why breaching a dam is a good metaphor. It's a terrible metaphor, but you know what I mean? It's like I think you can get to that other side, but it takes effort. It takes timing and and luck. And if luck is when preparation meets opportunity, I'm a believer in that, which is that you can try and learn whatever craft you're going to be pursuing, acting, writing, directing, designing, um, hanging lights, whatever, and then just trying to put yourself in a position and working on something that is on, the ability to break through on YouTube delights me every single day, and the trick is, how does that then become part of the bigger industry? I don't have the answer to that. But I do think being part of making something and being persistent and then putting yourself in the right situation, i.e., maybe you have to move to Los Angeles or New York or Atlanta or Vancouver where they're making things, but I honestly don't know. I am an optimist because I think that the business is in a challenging time, but I also know that there will be hits and they won't be coming from where we expect it. And
Mm.
there's always an audience for, and so if you can just persist and stick around long enough to land on a job and you do that one job well, then you can keep moving ahead. But that's a little bit of a Pollyanna-ish response, and I apologize.
No, I mean, you're talking about the realities of the industry, right? It is absolutely shifting, and I think the LA Times just did a piece on how, as you point out, ratings are going down. They're just plummeting for
Yeah.
cable, even for streaming. The competition is fierce, but you can create your own content, which is this whole
Yes.
new
Yes.
world.
And you can learn, and that's the thing, is like you can be curious and you can learn and try and get better. And yeah, again, I'm a fan of, you can always be reading something, but, and I know reading's boring sometimes. I sound like a teacher, I'm sorry. But you know what I mean? You can always be like watching something. There's just a lot out there to sate your curiosity. And I think the single biggest thing is to identify what you love, and do you love documentaries? And do that. Do you love hour-long, serialized Game of Thrones type things? Do that. Do you just love stand-up comedy? Do that. I think it is important to choose a lane, and you can change lanes, but you got to choose one thing at a time, is something I do believe.
Well, let's end with asking you what you're working on. What lane are you in,
That's
Bill?
funny. Yeah, I've been actually writing a couple of pilots, and it's interesting that you're talking about it. One in particular is very much influenced by this idea of males and masculinity, and we'll see where it goes. I don't want to talk about it for fear of ever jinxing anything. I don't know why I believe in jinxes. I'm grown up, um, but I do. Yeah, I have things, and all the things that I'm working on and we'll see where they go, all have aspects um, of subverting or opening up the idea of what a man is or what a particular character is. Like, I've come to believe that more important than anything is vulnerability in a character, and turning that into comedy is a challenge, but it's really fun. So I have a couple of things that I'm working on, several of which are attempting to drill down into this idea of what it means to be a guy, just because, or what it means to be a grown-up even, because in theory I'm a grown-up, but not always. So, I have a few things that I'm working on, and they're, we'll see where they go, and yeah, but I wish I could say something specific, because that was mean. Somebody said to me, "We love it, let's do this," and nobody did that today yet. So, but anyway, so thank you for asking. So, and I'm also, I started out as a playwright, and so I'm actually working on a play. So I'm just trying to um, stay creative and stay curious.
Well, I'm sure whatever it is, it's going to be pushing that cultural envelope and promoting healthy masculinity, even though that's kind of the secondary part of it, because good storytelling is number one. Bill, it's just been a pleasure talking with you
Oh,
today. I really
thanks,
appreciate your
Caroline.
work.
I know I say this every time you interview me, and she's only interviewed me twice, by the way, but you're a very thoughtful questioner and very clear with what you're trying to get at, and I really appreciate it.
Means the world coming from you, Bill. Thank you.
Okay.
And thank you for joining us today, folks. See you all soon.